All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel, and we've been in the midst of doing a bunch of Bible decodes using the Roman origins hypothesis and the many books that have followed that line of thinking. And today we're looking at another set of passages from Michael Menescot's, Menasgotz, and his book Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. So the Roman origins hypothesis posits that the New Testament, in whole or in part, and in some cases the Old Testament as well, were written by the Romans. They were written by the Caesars as a psychological operation toward the Jews. And the Jews had been a big thorn in the side of the Romans over the last 100+ years since the Romans took over in Judea at about 63 BC. And the Jews have been nearly constantly uprising, insurrecting, revoluting, and warring against the Romans because primarily of their monotheistic religion that showed that that they felt that they were the chosen people, and their God had them following a lot of idiosyncratic rituals, kosher food laws, animal sacrifice laws, circumcision laws, strictures against graven images, and the Romans just were tired of it because the Romans were really actually they were quite religiously tolerant. They were prepared to let you have your own religion as long as you, worship Caesar also. And so the Jews were not down with that, and the Jews were willing to die to maintain their own rituals and maintain their own beliefs. And the final evidence, maybe the straw that broke the camel's back, was the Jewish War of 66 to 73 AD. And in Jerusalem, a number of Jewish zealots. Now, keep in mind that the Jews from the Old Testament had been waiting for a Messiah. They were expecting a Messiah. But the Messiah that they were expecting was a military leader who was going to lead them up to kick out the Romans of the Holy Land, or kick out whoever the oppressor was. But in this case, it was the Romans. And a number of candidates for that Jewish Messiah came to the fore here at the Jewish War of 66 AD. That included Eleazar, John, and Simon. And they all kind of worked together, and they expelled the Romans from Jerusalem. And they caused Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian. And that was in about 66 AD, and Vespasian proceeded to lay siege on the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, Nero was eventually assassinated, and a Roman civil war broke out, the year of the 4 emperors. Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, all were assassinated shortly after becoming emperors. Nero, not Nero, but the other 3 were all assassinated within the scope of a year. And finally, Vespasian got the call. You're going to be the new emperor. And so he handed the reins of the military over to his son Titus, and he went to Rome. Now, Titus then fought and eventually ended this war in 73 AD. Both Titus and Vespasian were injured in the war, and I'm sure both of them were very tired of dealing with the Jews. And so the Romans decided to engage in one of their strengths, and something that was right down their MO. They had created a number of religions prior to this in the first century, or in the first century BC as well. So they took advantage of the fact that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, and they proposed a Jewish Messiah. Instead of a military leader, they proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and to exhort his followers to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do, and to confine his wrath to the Jews, such as when he overturned the tables of the money changers outside the temple. Those were Jews who were taking the Roman money that had graven images on it and exchanging it for Jewish money, which didn't, so that they could bring it into the temple, and disrupting the commerce of the Jews outside the temple that were selling doves and pigeons for the animal sacrifice rituals. So when Jesus decided to, act, he acted against the Jews and against the Jewish rituals. And he acted in favor of Rome. And Paul is even worse. Paul is more pro-Roman than even Jesus is. We don't get too much into Paul here yet at this point. We're mainly focused on the Gospels. And so what Vespasian and Titus did to kind of piece it together is they, at least according to the theory, which I think, we're trying to see the proof of this theory. What they did is they wrote the story of Jesus, and they backdated the story by 40 years. So they set the story in the early 30s AD, and Jesus has a 3-year ministry in Judea. And at the same time that they wrote the Gospels, they also wrote a history of this war that they fought against the Jews. It's called War of the Jews, and it was written by a person named Josephus, who may or may not have existed, but whoever he was, according to his autobiography, he was a member of the family of the Flavians. That's the dynasty of Caesars that included Vespasian and Titus, and Titus's younger brother Domitian. And Josephus was known as Flavius Josephus because he was an adopted member of their family, and he was one of the court historians at Caesar's palace, and he lived there the whole time that he was writing his 7-volume work called War of the Jews. And 20 years later, he was still there when he was writing his 20-volume work called The Antiquities of the Jews. So those, the work of Josephus and the Gospels are intended to be read intertextually together as a companion piece, and they were written by the same people at the same time for the same reasons. So the Gospels were written by the Romans, and Josephus was written by the Romans. Neither one of them can be taken seriously as facts. They are both wartime propaganda in order to mellow out the Jews, or they have a whole theme of it they call domesticating the Jews, or pruning the root and branch of the Jews. So the root and branch is like the Old Testament, and then the New Testament is like a replacement for this kind of militant aspect of the Jews with this Prince of Peace aspect. And that is a domestication of, and they have a whole set of themes on those set of parallels between those two books. There are many different themes of the parallels. We've gone through also how Jesus has a 3-year military campaign, 3-year ministry in Judea. Titus has a 3-year military campaign in Judea. And every place that Jesus goes, Titus also goes in the same order. And wherever they go, they encounter similar events. They're not the same, but they are typologically the same. There are parallels between them. They go in the same order and to the same locations. And a lot of the things that Jesus prophesies, that he predicts are going to happen, the prophecies are fulfilled by Titus. When the prophecy is made, the fulfillment of the prophecy by Titus occurs 40 years to the day from the time that the prophecy was made. And it occurs at the same location that the prophecy was made. Now, Michael Menescotz, in his book, Christianity's Origins, he looks into the book of Luke and Josephus's Jewish War and tries to find as many parallels as he can. He found an astounding 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. That's over 10 per chapter. That's like one every 4 or 5 verses. And not only that, but he graphed them out. And so he put the book of Luke on the vertical axis and the War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Wherever he found a parallel, he put a dot. If Jesus is parodying Joseph, or if New Testament is paralleling Josephus, it's a blue dot. If Josephus is parodying the Gospels, it's a black dot. There might be a vice versa there. But either way, after plotting all 250 plus points, he recognizes that he has made 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, A, P, T, V, S. Now, we're pretty sure that the TVS stands for Titus Vespasian, because Titus and Vespasian used the TVS imprint on many of their coins. Vespasian used the VS imprint on his coins that they minted for the Roman Empire. The AP, I believe, is for Arius Piso, who was a noble of a Roman nobility who, from a powerful family, who was a relative of the Flavians, and who kind of was a shadow emperor behind the scenes of both Vespasian and Titus. Now, if you want to see that those graphs or those charts, that's the thumbnail for the video, and you can see that the letters are pretty, accurate, or pretty much perfect letters in Latin. So basically, this means that not only did the Romans write the Gospels, but they literally sign their name to them. But you just have to know the code. So he's trying to figure out here in this passage how it was done, meaning he thinks, now if you look at the thumbnail, you can see that the V and the S are much more well developed than the A, P, and the T, especially the A and the P. Those are undeveloped, but the V and the S are really well developed. And if you look at the parallels that correspond to them, the parallels are also much more detailed, much more convincing, much more thought was put into them. And so he's kind of saying that Vespasian put together, so that the War of the Jews was kind of put together in stages, which I think is highly possible because the first of the 7 books, the first 2 or 3 books are spent just getting up to 66 AD. The war actually started in 66 AD, but the book itself starts at like 100 BC. And it gives you all the events that lead up to that. So it's very feasible that the A, P, and possibly the T were written later, in a later period. So he's going to kind of analyze that here. So in the absence of being able to carbon date the manuscripts, since we only have copies of copies, I suggest the most likely order of events was as follows. Editing process for version 1 of Jewish War during Vespasian's reign, to decide to create a religion based on Pauline literature. Now, here Menescott and I strongly disagree. He believes that the Pauline literature actually may have been legitimate, and that the stuff in the Gospels is the stuff that he's focused on for being a fiction and being a psychological operation. But there are a number of authors who I think conclusively show that the Pauline epistles were written in a later period, and that they were written primarily by Pliny the Younger. And you can see, just like Titus and Jesus both go to the same places in the same order, Pliny goes to the same places that Paul goes to in his letters. So anyway, we'll hash that out later. Based on the Pauline literature, but secretly paralleling Vespasian's story to reveal him as the second coming. Now, because that's what, when Jesus is making the prophecies and they're fulfilled by Titus or Vespasian, that means that Titus or Vespasian or both are the second coming of Jesus. The second coming is not happening now. It happened in 70 AD. Okay, so he says, edit both stories to create a V rather than a diagonal line. And so if the right-hand side of the V, basically the stories go in the same order in both books. As you move further through the book of Luke, you're also moving further through the Josephus. And so those are mainly the parallels that Joseph Atwill found. He found a set of like 46 consecutive events that were parallel between the two books. He calls that the Flavian signature. That's kind of the right-hand side of the V. So, and then the left-hand side of the V is really editing kind of the other way around. So let's see what he says. Edit both stories to create a V rather than a diagonal line to enable faith in Jesus to be later undermined. Extend the end of Jewish war and edit both stories to turn the V into VS. So editing either during Vespasian's or Titus's reign. Vespasian reigned from 69 to 79 AD, and Titus just reigned from 79 to 81 AD. Extend the beginning to turn the VS into TVS. There's no tangible evidence suggesting that Luke was simultaneously edited, so perhaps this occurred after Luke was published. This might be a late addition to what was called the first official version, or an early addition to what was called the second version of Josephus. The editing process for version 2 of the Jewish War, the surviving version, either during Titus's reign or Domitian's, extend the beginning of Jewish War by adding 300 paragraphs on a different topic, meaning the first 150 years preceding the 66 AD war. Add parallels to Jewish war that evoke Luke, albeit without editing Luke, turning the TVS into APTVS, albeit in a rushed manner. Then a much longer version of the first half of Jewish war was created 20 years later, called Antiquities of the Jews, apparently taking the opportunity to fix the patchiness of the A and the P. Well, he doesn't give any evidence for that. He hasn't gone over Antiquities of the Jews and to see about the patchiness. And it's, I don't know, maybe he has, because it's not really that patchy. There's a couple of patches in the A and a few little patches in the P, but you can definitely see that it's APT, and the V and the S are quite well defined. Okay, so he's summarizing this saying, original version was just Vespasian's story with Jesus' story paralleling it. And then the other half of the V, text adjusted to parody Luke back and make a V. Addition of book 7 of the 7-volume War of the Jews with more parallels to present a V and an S. And then 100 paragraphs added to add a T. Apparently Luke wasn't edited to parody this section back, so perhaps Luke was already published by this time. And then add 200 more paragraphs to add the AP. It's really more like 360, I believe. Over 300 to add the AP, apparently in a rush, given the lack of care and detail. The parallels from the AP are not as high quality as the parallels of the, not even close, as the parodies in the VS. These parallels where Luke parodies Jewish war might have been present in the much shorter original version, forming the start of the diagonal line. Antiquities of the Jews retells the same story as Jewish war and seems to offer new details to patch up the weaker areas in the A and the P. Okay, going to flip over the page and hopefully this goes smoothly. Okay, now the next section starts with, so if TVS are the initials of Titus and Vespasian, what do the AP initials stand for? If we are looking for someone important with the initials AP, it is trivial to find such a person in the Gospel of Luke. The Holy Spirit is described in the Gospels as being more sacred, or rather more unblasphemable, than Jesus. And in the original text, the initials of this Holy Spirit are, in Greek, are Agion Pneuma. A-G-I-O-N P-N-E-U-M-A. A-P. I think this is wrong, flat out, but we'll let him speak here. But this doesn't entirely solve our problem, since it doesn't tell us what this really relates to. Even Christians acknowledge that the identity or name of the Holy Spirit is one of the mysteries that has never been revealed to them. Whilst I don't deny that the New Testament points to a triple God, the Trinity, reading the synoptic gospel verses, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Reading the synoptic gospel verses about this AP, the Agion Pneuma, or Holy Spirit, it seems very much like a title rather than a proper name. The way that characters become filled with this Holy Spirit is evocative of it being a property, therefore saying that they are filled with holiness or divinity. Examples include Zacharias being filled with the Holy Spirit, Jesus being filled with the Holy Spirit, Elizabeth, Paul, the disciples, all filled with the Holy Spirit. This suggests the Holy Spirit, Agion Pneuma, or AP, is a characteristic, therefore the characteristic of holiness, and as such could be a valid title comparable to the more modern His Holiness. So it could be a title of Titus and Vespasian. Their holinesses, but that would be in plural. I guess that would probably still be Agion Pneuma. Okay. There is also another title beginning with P to explore. Historians agree that the royal Piso family were incredibly powerful at the time of Vespasian. This can be illustrated by pointing out that one of them was named heir to the throne by the short-lived Emperor Galba, just 6 months before the first legions declared their loyalty to Vespasian. So if we were looking for a title with a word beginning with P, the royal Piso lineage is an obvious candidate. In publications by Roman Piso and Abelard Reuchlin, and by Henry Davis, it is shown that the Gospels repeatedly hint toward an undocumented royal with the name Arius Piso, AP. Roman Piso's view is that this Arius Piso is a distinct person, and he isn't to be confused with Emperor Titus. However, Roman Piso explains the lack of any mention of Arius Piso in historical records by suggesting that there are hints that this Arius Piso is referenced in War of the Jews using that very name, Titus. Now, mainly the evidence that Reuchlin and Piso are using, this is Roman Piso, who claims to be a distant relative of Arius Piso. They kind of piece it together using a shell game of names where they look very closely. Both of them are fluent in both Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and they look at the letters that are written between Pliny the Younger, this other character who goes by the name of Arius Piso, or doesn't go by the name of Arius Piso, but goes by several other names, and Tacitus, Suetonius, and a number Plutarch, a number of other Roman intellectuals who wrote letters back and forth to each other, and kind of through the process of elimination, they figured out that independently, they figured out that Arius Piso was the person who primarily wrote the New Testament. But Menescott says, I find this position difficult, since my work shows that the Gospels and Jewish war are designed to laud Emperor Titus. His name and identity is the exact one that the author would seek to avoid causing confusion over. It's a valid point. Vespasian and Titus's primary goal was to cement their hold on the throne, so it seems grossly contrary to their goals to design a new religion to promote worship of a potential rival. But I don't think he's acknowledging that Arius Piso is a close relative of both Vespasian and Titus. And so, you know, they're not really necessarily rivals. But supposing we were to imagine that Titus was so enamored with this hypothesized cousin Arius Piso to allow much of the new religion's focus to be on him, even though it might undermine his reign by promoting a potential rival. It seems jarringly strange that this cousin would go unmentioned in Jewish war, and indeed anywhere else in history. Now, both Reuchlin and Roman Piso say that Arius Piso's primary pseudonym is Josephus, that he is Josephus. War of the Jews talks about Titus and Vespasian ad nauseum, yet never explicitly mentions this supposedly central Arius Piso. Consistently, the propaganda focuses on the ruler and never on a potential rival, which matches the approach taken by every authoritarian ruler in history. For the letter A, a clue is found in the book of Acts, where Paul gives his key sermon on Mars Hill. Mars is also known as Ares in the Greek. So he gives his key sermon on Mars Hill, more correctly known as Areopagus, or literally Ares Hill, since Ares is another name for Mars. In legend, it is where the god Mars supposedly was tried before being vindicated. It is here on Ares Hill that, according to Acts, Paul proclaimed that he beheld an altar with an inscription to the unknown God. Luke and Jewish War offer a parallel pair of passages which jointly evoke the story of Paul, who according to Acts was also called Saul, with Jewish War going as far as placing Titus on Saul's hill. This associates Titus with an unknown god on the hill of the god Ares. This offers a hint that the A in the APTVS is Ares, the god Mars, and APTVS stands for Ares Piso Titus. It sounds like a stretch to me, but with this in mind, I respectfully suggest a modification to Roman Piso's theory, and that the AP stands for Ares Piso, and is a title that Titus planned to be worshipped by. So in summary, Roman Piso suggested that the intention was to reveal a Roman royal called Arius Piso, who was covertly referred to using the name Titus.